Persia, vast and radiant, sat at the very core of the Islamic world. Trade routes wound through deserts and over mountain passes, carrying silk from China, spices from India, and scholarly manuscripts produced in the great intellectual centers of Baghdad and Nishapur. At the empire's helm stood the Khwarazmian ruler, Sultan Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, an ambitious monarch hungry to cement his authority. His domain was expansive, yet beneath its glittering exterior, fractures were forming. Rebellious provincial governors, farmers ground down by excessive taxation, and a tenuous grip on cities that quietly harbored their own aspirations for independence. Far to the east, a different kind of power was taking shape. From the windswept grasslands of Mongolia, Genghis Khan had assembled a military force unlike anything the world had witnessed. His cavalry moved with the swiftness of a tempest, disciplined, merciless, and bound together by unshakable loyalty. They had already brought kingdoms in China and Central Asia to their knees. Now Genghis turned his attention westward. He did not approach Persia initially as a destroyer, but as a potential partner, dispatching caravans and diplomatic envoys in the spirit of commerce and mutual benefit. Genghis Khan moved quickly to establish a working relationship with Sultan Muhammad II, acknowledging him as a ruler of considerable standing. In 1218, he dispatched a trade delegation of 450 merchants, carrying goods alongside a letter extending an offer of friendship, commerce, and political cooperation. Yet at the border city of Otrar, the local governor, Inalchuk, saw not an opportunity for diplomacy, but a chance for plunder. Branding the travelers as spies, he confiscated their merchandise and had them put to death. Angered but measured in his response, Genghis Khan sent representatives to demand accountability. The Sultan not only dismissed the request, but committed an act that crossed every boundary of acceptable conduct. He had the Mongol envoys killed, returning their remains as a deliberate insult. When word of the Otrar massacre reached Genghis Khan, he made one final attempt to resolve the matter through negotiation rather than force. He dispatched an envoy to Samarkand demanding that Inalchuk be handed over. Sultan Muhammad refused. The governor was a kinsman of many high-ranking commanders within the Khwarazmian military, making his surrender politically unacceptable. Worse still, Muhammad had the Muslim envoy executed upon arrival at the capital. For Genghis Khan, this was an unmistakable declaration of war, and preparations for a full-scale invasion began immediately. Muhammad II had gravely misjudged the danger he now faced. In the preceding year alone, he had levied taxes on his population 3 times over, seeding deep resentment among his own subjects. A war council was convened, and his most experienced generals urged him to allow the Mongols to advance into Transoxiana, terrain his forces knew intimately, and where they might hold a meaningful advantage. But the Sultan dismissed their counsel. Rather than concentrating his armies into a unified and formidable fighting force, he dispersed them thinly across the empire, assigning troops to defend individual cities. Fracturing his own military strength, he then withdrew from the empire's core and retreated toward Balkh, leaving Persia exposed to the approaching storm. In September 1219, Genghis Khan crossed into Khwarazmian territory, methodically dividing his forces into 3 separate columns. His sons Ogedei and Chagatai were tasked with laying siege to Otrar. His eldest son Jochi was sent to subdue settlements along the Sir Darya River. Genghis himself, accompanied by his youngest son Tului, led the principal force in a direct march toward Bukhara. The siege of Otrar lasted 5 months before treachery from within opened the city gates, and it finally fell. Governor Inalchuk was captured and put to death, and the city itself was reduced to rubble. With Otrar gone, the road into the Khwarazmian heartland lay unobstructed. In 1220, Genghis Khan launched his assault on Bukhara with the full weight of his main army. Sultan Muhammad was caught entirely off guard. He had expected the Mongols to strike Samarkand first, and had stationed his primary field army there accordingly. In Bukhara, only the garrison remained to mount a defense. Though the defenders resisted fiercely, the city fell in under 2 weeks. What followed was devastating. Thousands of unarmed civilians were slaughtered, and the survivors were taken as enslaved labor. The Mongols then turned and marched towards Samarkand. The Sultan had invested heavily in Samarkand's defense, reinforcing its fortifications and garrisoning approximately 50,000 soldiers within its walls. The Mongol siege began with the complete encirclement of the city, severing all supply lines and outside communication. Genghis Khan deployed his characteristic blend of psychological pressure and tactical deception, directing his artillery and archers to hammer the walls without pause. Inside, the Khwarazmian commanders resolved on a bold and desperate gamble. Their cavalry charged out to engage the Mongols head-on, flanked by armored war elephants, their steel-tipped tusks intended to crush the enemy beneath their enormous mass. At first it appeared to work. The Mongols seemed to give way, their riders falling back in apparent disarray. The defenders surged forward in pursuit, convinced that victory was near. But it was a feint. Once the Khwarazmian forces had been drawn far enough from the city walls and beyond the protective range of their own archers, the Mongols reversed course and attacked with full force. The cavalry was systematically encircled and cut apart. On the battlements of Samarkand, the city's inhabitants watched as their final hope dissolved in a cloud of dust and blood. The charge had been crushed entirely, with the great majority of Khwarazmian horsemen killed. Panic spread rapidly through the streets. Mercenary troops abandoned their posts, some defecting to the enemy outright. Within days, the magnificent city, long considered the crown jewel of Transoxiana, fell to Genghis Khan. His forces entered and carried out a massacre of the population. Only the most devoted defenders mounted any form of last resistance. When the violence subsided, Samarkand had been transformed into a wasteland and lay effectively abandoned. Following the city's surrender, Genghis Khan directed his forces deeper into Khwarazmian lands. His trusted generals Subutai and Jebe swept through Persia with terrifying speed. Cities that chose to resist were razed to the ground, their populations wiped out or enslaved. This systematic brutality crippled whatever remained of Persian military resistance and sowed dread across the entire region, persuading many cities to open their gates rather than face annihilation. Sultan Muhammad II fled westward, abandoning his people and irreparably fragmenting what remained of the empire's ability to defend itself. Genghis sent Subutai and Jebe in relentless pursuit, initiating one of the most celebrated cavalry campaigns in recorded history, covering thousands of miles across Persia. Exhausted, stripped of power, abandoned by nearly all who had once served him, and ravaged by illness, Muhammad eventually sought refuge on a small island in the Caspian Sea. There he died in December 1220. With his passing, the Khwarazmian state had effectively ceased to exist. His son Jalal ad-Din attempted to regroup and organize resistance, but his efforts were fragmented and consistently outmatched by the Mongols' superior coordination and tactical versatility. Cities including Nishapur, Herat, Merv, and Ray suffered catastrophic destruction. Entire populations were wiped out in acts of collective punishment designed both to exact retribution and to serve as unmistakable warnings to anyone who might contemplate defiance. Farmland was ravaged, centuries-old irrigation networks were dismantled, and once thriving urban centers were emptied of life. Persia's rich cultural and intellectual tradition, for centuries among the most dynamic in the Islamic world, fell into a prolonged decline beneath the weight of Mongol conquest. Yet this invasion also set into motion changes that would unfold over generations. Mongol rulers gradually evolved from destroyers into administrators. The Ilkhanate, later established in Persia under Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, became a foundational component of the broader Mongol Empire, transforming conquest, in time, into